in your plan as the addict, you have to set the boundaries. We're so used to placating and saying, okay, you tell me where my boundaries need to be so you feel safe, which means you won't get mad at me. Right? And that's not going to be an effective boundary. Part of this transformation is to be an initiator and to stand up and say, this is what I need for my own sobriety, and that's the reason I'm doing it. It doesn't matter what you do. You can get mad at me, you could be happy with me, you could leave me, or you could stay. It doesn't matter. These are the boundaries that I'm putting in place to stay sober initially and ultimately to grow into the person that I want to be.
Right.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're happy to be back with you today with our host, Dr. Greg Miller. How are you, Greg?
I'm good. It's good to be here.
Greg, we had so much strong response to the last podcast in which we had as our special guest Russ.
Just a clamoring.
Russ and Susie Smidt. The phones have been just ringing off the hook. And so Russ and Susie are back with us today to give us their experience and their knowledge and their wisdom on this subject of things that couples do to regain trust.
Absolutely. So we're continuing this series, and what's true is we have a list of things, and we're going to be dividing this up among various people on our staff to be talking about it. And so even the fact that there's a list, I think, is important to just highlight that there's not just one thing that someone can do to begin to rebuild trust. It's going to take a variety of different things. And today we're going to be talking about, again, just to identify that Faithful and True, we work with men who struggle with sexual addiction, and we work with their spouses. So in our language, we use the masculine pronoun for someone who's struggling with an addiction. So we're going to be talking about husbands who are trying to rebuild trust with their spouse. And we're going to be talking about boundaries. So what is it about boundaries that you see, Susie, as important when you begin to work with a wife?
I think they bring safety.
Okay.
A lot of safety, because the disclosure of this, the discovery of this is maybe very new and traumatic. Maybe it's years and years and years old. But in the case of a wife who is just kind of shocked, everything comes into question. In her reality, like, if I missed this, what else have I missed? Or, what is my safety? What is my life? What does my look like?
Right.
And so when a husband can come to her with, here's some things I'm doing to make changes, it's a piece, at least, of the safety that she's starting to rebuild.
One of the things that we talk about at the men's workshop, because we do talk about boundaries at the workshop, is this idea that when boundaries are drawn well, people are safe. And so we're constantly wanting to evaluate what are the boundaries that I need. And as adults, we're responsible for creating safe boundaries for children. And so when our parents draw good boundaries, then children are safe. We learn that as a skill, and so therefore we become adults who draw good boundaries. The problem for those of us who struggle with addiction, many of us, it wasn't modeled for us to draw good boundaries. Either the boundaries were too rigid, which meant that there were needs that went unmet, or the boundaries were too fluid, they weren't drawn clearly, and so therefore there's invasion. And so we talk about this idea of when a boundary is drawn well, there's not invasion, there's not abandonment, there's safety. So it makes sense if I was a child and boundaries weren't drawn well, I become an adult that struggles to know where the boundaries are. And I can imagine for a wife, when she starts to find out about stuff that she didn't know anything about, there's probably this question, well, if he was willing to do this, or he did this, what other things did he possibly do that I don't know about?
Right. And imagining worse than perhaps their husband even did. But it's a normal reaction, right? The mind kind of goes wild, and it's, what am I dealing with here?
Right. I think for a lot of men, when they get those early accusations of other things that they possibly did, Well, it's really tempting to say something like, well, of course I didn't do that.
Right,
Which
right.
just isn't helpful.
Yeah.
It's more helpful to say, well, of course you would wonder if I had done that.
Right.
Because if there are no boundaries or limited boundaries in my life, then it makes perfect sense. My spouse is going to have questions about what I've done and what I've not done. When you start working with a man, Russ, like, does he come with an understanding of boundaries? Is that a conversation that you want to have with him? Or is that just something that kind of evolves over time?
Well, it's one of the first things we talk about is a recovery plan, a written recovery plan. A lot of guys will come and say, well, yeah, I've got a plan. And I'll say, let's see it. And they'll say, well, it's all in my head. Well, that's not really a plan. And part of that recovery plan includes boundaries. And I think you're right. Some guys have experience with boundaries being set for them. Some guys don't have any idea what a boundary looks like. I know that in my old life as a pediatrician, what I saw all the time were guys and more women having no boundaries around their video gaming. And I can tell you multiple times, not just a couple, multiple times, the first time that a guy had to stop playing his video game on his own, and not have his parents tell him to stop, was when they went off to college. And I had more than 2 handfuls of people that flunked out of school because they weren't able to set their own boundaries. They had no practice at it. And so, you can come into addiction in the same way. I've never had to set my own boundaries. And it could be, when you were sexual with girls, you always had the girl put on the brakes, your girlfriend so I think this idea for some guys of putting up a boundary sounds scary. It feels scary. I think it does take some talking about how to set safe boundaries for yourself and acknowledge that you're setting the boundary for yourself. The guys that experience no boundaries, that can feel unsafe to them at first because they feel like, well, this is a restriction on my freedom. I can't be who I really am if I have a boundary. And they don't see the fact that you can actually be more of who you want to be if you set a boundary.
Right. Well, and even that idea of safety. Like you said, for a lot of guys, their first thought is, well, that's going to be limiting. That's going to be restrictive. And yet we do need boundaries in every aspect of our life. We need boundaries in our spending. We need boundaries in how we spend our time watching TV or playing video games. And we need boundaries in how we define ourselves and the choices that we make sexually. And so if I can begin to understand this idea that when I cross a boundary, I'm actually entering into unsafe space for me. If I'm overspending, ultimately that's not safe. If I'm not balancing my schedule and my time, that will lead to a lack of safety. And so sometimes if we can experience those consequences of what it is to live outside of my boundaries and really own those and see those, that can be a motivation to be able to draw boundaries in the future. The problem is, for those of us who struggle with addiction, we dismiss the consequences. We minimize the consequences. We avoid the consequences. So the natural consequences aren't doing what they're intended to do when we dismiss them. And it's not until a wife finds out and the wife is expressing her hurt, her anger, maybe for the first time, that a husband can begin to see my choices do impact other people. There are consequences when I cross a boundary.
And I'm working on helping wives identify needs, for sure, and that's sometimes brand new or sometimes not, and differentiating how that's different from setting her husband's boundaries.
Right.
Of course she needs to be asking for her needs, but not setting up his boundaries for him, and it's tricky sometimes.
Right.
You want to say what we did in the need boundary area with the phone calls? Well, initially,
Why don't you say?
sure. So
I don't know what
yeah.
think about.
One of the fallacies is that if you're married long enough, you know what the other person's thinking. That's not always true. No, when we were involved in this pre-cell phone, and so one of the things about my acting out is I would use time when I was supposedly at work or having lunch or whatever, and I would act out. And so in my recovery plan, I didn't feel like I needed to check in with people throughout the day. I had other parts of my recovery plan, but you felt that it would feel safer to you if you expressed your need around that.
Sure. Right. I felt very unsafe about where you were at during your day because that was a piece of what had happened in the past. Mm-hmm. And so the idea was you used other men to talk and call to stay sober, but he had this system of phone calls. Like mm-hmm. it was the kitchen landline, right, and mm-hmm. the office phone. So I see the number, and he's like, "Okay, I'm at the office. Okay, have a good day," And then he'd call me at noon, tell me what he's doing for lunch. Mm-hmm. And again, at the end of the day, I'm on my way home, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to stop at the bank, or I'm coming straight home, or whatever. And mm-hmm. those were, that's something you set, though, and because of the, that's how I remember it. Mm-hmm. It's something you offered me.
Yeah, I guess I'm making a distinction between, and I think it's important that in your plan as the addict, you have to set the boundaries. We're so used to placating and saying, okay, you tell me mm-hmm. where my boundaries need to be so you feel safe, which means you won't get mad at me. Right? And that's not going to be an effective boundary. Part of this transformation is to be an initiator and to stand up and say, this is what I need for my own sobriety, and that's the reason I'm doing it. It doesn't matter what you do. You can get mad at me, you could be happy with me, you could leave me, or you could stay. It doesn't matter. These are the boundaries that I'm putting in place to stay sober initially and ultimately to grow into the person that I want to be.
Right. Well, and the idea is the need isn't for someone to check in. The need is to be safe. And this is one of the ways you can contribute to somebody's safety. I've said this on a podcast before, but this thing about safety, nobody can make us feel safe. Safety is something that comes from within ourselves, and people can contribute to our safety, but they can't make us feel safe.
Yeah.
And so we can say, it would be helpful for me if there was some accountability around where you were. Mm-hmm. That would contribute to my safety. Mm-hmm. But even if you choose not to do that, I can still be safe mm-hmm. because I have within myself the capacity to create safety.
Yeah.
And my safety may be I may need to distance myself from you. I may need to close off a part of myself to you while you figure that out. But I get to make choices around my safety. And I do think that can be one of the mistakes a wife can make is, well, if my husband draws his boundaries perfectly, then I will feel safe. Mm-hmm. And the reality is he may be drawing boundaries really well, and she's still struggling to feel safe because she hasn't figured out what it takes within herself to create safety. Mm-hmm. So this boundary contributes to it. It cannot create it for somebody else, but it can help to create it for myself because I can create safety for myself.
Mm-hmm. So can we use some specific examples of boundaries? Would that be helpful? Yeah. Okay. Here's one of the most common ones. Guys act out on their phone. We know that research would say about 70% of acting out with pornography is on the phone. So guys will act out when they bring their phone in the bathroom. So one boundary that's really common is say, well, I'm not going to bring my phone in the bathroom. That's a very, very simple, easy to describe boundary. And it's something that if you commit to it, it's going to be helpful. Mm-hmm. It's not going to create sobriety, but it's going to make it less likely that you'll act out.
Right.
And I think it's helpful for wives, rather than going into great detail about what you fall into doing in the bathroom with your mm-hmm. phone, mm-hmm. to just say, I've decided not to take my phone in the bathroom.
Right.
And instead of supplying big, long lists so wives can fixate on, oh, he has trouble with billboards, or, oh, he has trouble with whatever, for you to instead say, here's what I'm doing about it. Mm-hmm. Here's what I'm doing about it. Right. If channel surfing was a thing, then you would say, I've decided not to watch television by myself, or I've decided not to watch TV after you go to bed at night. And then you don't go into all the details of, so she has more fuel to imagine things. Mm-hmm. It just creates safety that you've set that boundary for yourself, and she can relax a little bit.
Right. I once heard a guy say that one of the boundaries he created is that he no longer watched TV, he watched shows.
Right.
And I thought that was just a great
good
way to say
distinction.
it. So I don't get on and just see what's there. If I turn the TV on, it's because there's something specific that I want to watch. I could say the same thing about the internet. I don't surf the net. I don't just go and see what is out there. But if I want to check the scores, or if I want to see how the stocks are doing, or if I just want to read a little bit of the news, I'm going for a very specific purpose. I meet that goal, and then I get out. It's the wandering, I think, that creates so much chaos. And the boundaries, one of the things when they're drawn well can help us to do is to stop the wandering around and kind of seeing what is out there. And I've heard a lot of guys say, well, I wasn't looking for it. But what's true is if I'm positioning myself enough, eventually it's going to come to me, or I am going to find it.
Right.
So it's a very specific way to step into those spaces that have historically been challenging for someone.
Yeah.
And in the past, I didn't see the acting out happening, or the wife didn't see the acting out happening, but she can see the boundary being practiced and put into use. And I just think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that the boundary is only part of the solution. Not doing something, not crossing the boundary to do something, that's an act of following a rule, if you want to think about it that way. I'm not going to break that rule. If that's all you're doing, you're the equivalent of what we call a dry drunk, right? You're following the rules, but your heart hasn't really changed. So you have to, this is a fundamental principle of changing even a bad habit, is you have to replace it with something. And so part of the boundaries is when you're setting them, you're saying, okay, what is it that's leading me to cross that boundary? If it's something like boredom, I feel bored, I go on the internet and I browse, bored browsing. I'm going to get into trouble because I'm not addressing my boredom. And historically, if pornography has been the end result of that, then going into it bored is a problem. And so the not going on the internet is staying away from it, but finding what would be a healthy way to meet that boredom is the other side of that.
Right.
And so I always think of the boundary as being the edge of the Grand Canyon. If you have the boundary along the Grand Canyon, you put it there so you don't fall into the Grand Canyon and hurt yourself. And what's true is that if you have vertigo like I do, that's not far enough away. I need to be, a long, long way from the Grand Canyon. And when we set our boundaries, I think it's important to think that way, that we don't just, see how close to the edge we can get and put the boundary there. We're so committed to staying away from a place that's unhealthy for us that we are moving that boundary way back and then intentionally saying, okay, what can I do instead? Right? Because if you just say, oh, I'm going to watch my show on TV and now I turn off the TV, now what? Right? If I don't have anything else to do, it's going to be awfully easy to say, oh, I'm going to watch this show and then I'll stop. Or I'm going to watch this movie and then I stop. And then, you go on and on. So,
well, and that kind of highlights the idea that the first thing in this process is self-awareness, where I really grow in my capacity to identify where I am, what my needs are, what my desires are. And maybe a good boundary would be before I turn the TV on or before I go look at the scores, I'm going to take a moment to check in with myself so I can identify what am I thinking, what am I believing, what am I feeling, because I want to identify my vulnerabilities before I step into that space. It's kind of like the person who checks the parachute before they jump out of the plane. Just because you have a parachute, if you're not sure it's working and tied properly, it's probably not wise to jump out of the plane. So you want to do everything you can to make that wise choice, especially if you're going into a space that isn't necessarily dangerous for you and can lead to something that could be more complicated. I also want to go back to something that you said, Russ, about this idea of this is my boundary. This is my guideline. This is a choice that I've made for myself because I can hear it when someone says, my wife wants me to do this, or this is my wife's boundary, eventually that's going to lead to resentment. It just does. Or if I'm doing it out of obligation, resentment, obligation, those really are toxic to the recovery journey, because it has to be about desire. That I want this for myself. I want to become this man that God created me to be, and when I'm dabbling in these things, it's going to keep me from becoming that person.
Yeah, I often say that I get pretty militaristic. Is that right?
Or militant.
I get militant. I get pretty stern when I say you are in charge of your recovery. I'm not in charge of your recovery. The best-selling author is not in charge of your recovery. Your podcast guy, Greg, even Greg, is not is not in charge of your recovery. I know it.
You hear that edge of the Grand
Yeah,
Canyon.
that's right.
I back up a little bit.
Remember the vertigo.
Yeah. But I just say, if you allow anybody into that recovery, then you're tainting the recovery, and it becomes not about your motivation, your internal motivation to change. And by the same token, if anything gets added to your recovery or taken out of your recovery, that's also your decision. So in the example that Susie had, I was offering phone calling not because it was part of my recovery, but an act of service to her to help her with her safety. Now, she gets to decide then when she no longer needs it. Right. And so at one point she calls up, or I call her up, and she says, man, this is getting really annoying. Stop doing that. You don't have to do that anymore. This really bugs me that you're bothering me all the time. And so that was her decision, right? By the same token, I still have Covenant Eyes on my computer, and that it's a cost every month. And from time to time, Susie will ask me, do you still need that? And I'll say, well, I like it there. It makes me feel good. It's not that I'm, feeling really loose in my sobriety. It's comforting for me to have it there, and I like to support that company.
Yeah.
And so
Were the check-in phone calls effective?
Very. When I needed them, I really needed them.
Yeah.
They felt really comforting. And then when it was just funny that I became aware kind of all of a sudden, like, I don't need this anymore.
Right. Yeah. One thing too is the boundaries are beyond just the direct behavior of the acting out. We also have to understand those other factors that contribute to it.
Yeah,
and so there can be boundaries where, I know for a lot of men that needing cash that cannot be traced was a part of their acting out, because they wanted to spend money on something sexual. They didn't want anybody to know. And so they just had this habit of keeping cash with them. For a lot of men, one of the boundaries they create is, I will not have cash with me going forward. And so it's not directly about something sexual, but it is a contributing factor. And that was one of the ways that they got further away from the Grand Canyon, is by identifying, this is the line, I just won't have cash with me anymore. A very important one, I think, is when I'm checking in with my emotions. When I first started my recovery, my lack of emotional awareness was pretty significant. I was really very clueless. And I remember when I got fired from the job I was in and started working at a temporary place, I had some space, and so I began to write my emotions down. That was kind of a first step for me, was just simply to write, if I was feeling something, to put it down. And then eventually I created the process of, I would, on my drive home, call somebody in my group and share one of those emotions. And many times I would share more than one of those emotions. But that was like a boundary that I put in place. Before I got home, I wanted to have connected with someone so that I'm changing an old pattern of isolation. And then I gave myself a very specific topic. What did I feel today? And the people that were in my group were all working on their own emotional awareness, so it didn't seem like I was trying to speak French to someone who didn't speak French. We were all learning French together. But there can be a variety of different boundaries that we begin to put in place that do create safety. And plus, when I got home, if it was about anxiety, I had offloaded some of my anxiety, so I didn't just dump it on Beth. If it was about my fear, I didn't just dump my fear on Beth. I could include her without making her responsible for it by bringing it to my community. So as we're thinking of this boundary piece, it's important to recognize there's a variety of different layers to this that are helpful for us to identify. What would be your encouragement to a wife that does have some concern because either she's not sure what her husband's boundaries are, or it doesn't seem like he has created any or is trying to enforce any.
Well, we talk about what it looks like to ask for something she needs from her hoop. Like, that's a healthy way, not a controlling way. We talk about picking something that, rather than picking at a bunch of little things, because we are pretty annoyed in this time period, and it's tempting to be at him for all kinds of little stuff. Pick out something that is really important, that would have something to do with progress toward a recovery plan. We talk around here a lot about asking him to come to the men's workshop. That's kind of a big ask, but it often works,
Right.
in the first, in whatever amount of time, or asking him to find a counselor, or, starting to, I do the bit of an iceberg for her to say, how am I feeling? I'm feeling worried and anxious. What's the story in my head? The story in my head is, if you don't do something like this isn't going to change, or we're going to be back to square one. And then what do I need? It would be really helpful to me if you would sign up for the workshop. And, in that way, there's no being controlling in that.
Right.
And it's a really kind of a refreshing way to speak that we haven't usually done, just because
Right.
we haven't known how.
And the undercurrent of that is, my desire is for you to sign up for the workshop. And if you choose not to, I can still be safe, because my safety isn't dependent upon your choices.
Right.
My safety comes from the truth of who I am, the truth of who God is. It may be chaotic, it may be painful, it may be disruptive, and ultimately I am safe because you're not responsible for my safety. That offloads a lot of energy, because if someone else is responsible for my safety,
Yeah.
then I will do whatever I have to do to get them to do what I want them to do, because my safety is at stake.
Yeah.
But when I can detach my safety from their choices, then it can be about desire, it can be about our future, it can be about our relationship, and then I get to make my wise decision based upon what the other person chooses. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Right. It makes a lot of sense. And the temptation, if we ask for that need and he doesn't answer, or he puts you off, or he says flat out no, the temptation is to throw up our hands and say, well, that didn't work.
Right.
And I didn't get my need met, certainly, but that's not the end of my process. Then I have to ask myself, I choose to ask myself, okay, then what is next for me? Because that's not a yes right now, what does that lead me to need to do
Right.
next for myself?
Yeah, it's like his no, in whatever the area is, gives me more information and gives me some clarity that I can use to determine what my next right step is going to be.
Right.
Before we run out of time, I think we need to distinguish between boundaries for boundaries don't by themselves create sobriety. And all of us pre-recovery tried to stop. And by definition, if you tried to stop, you created some kind of boundary. And the reason it didn't work is because the boundary is not the solution. The boundary is an aid to the solution. So when we're setting up boundaries, we're not expecting the boundaries to change us. The boundaries are there while we're waiting to change. Right? And then as we change, the boundaries can change with it. But it's a mistake to think, oh, if I just set up the right boundaries, tell me what to do, tell me what I need to do. I need to deprive myself. I'm just going to not access media at all. I'm just going to be a monk around this. Well, if you're expecting that process to change you, it's not going to.
Right.
It's just there to help you for a time. It's like the guide rails in bowling. It just helps you. It doesn't make you a better bowler. It just keeps it out of the gutter,
Right.
And eventually, if you want to change and be a bowler, are you a bowler, Greg?
That's a big word. I am familiar with bowling.
Okay, all right.
And I have bowled before.
Okay.
And I'm really familiar with the bumper pad.
Oh, okay, all right.
So
Well,
yes,
good.
that analogy is
Okay,
working
it's
for me.
working. All right, good.
We
Just
have
checking that
videos
out.
to share with.
Well,
Greg.
one thing I would say is, so the idea of boundaries support the change I want to make.
Yeah.
They don't create the change I want to make.
Yeah. See, you always
There you go.
you always sum things
That's
up
why I
so well.
always turn to him for the closing statement.
That's right. That's right.
Well, once again, we want to thank Russ and Susie for their participation and their knowledge and experience, sharing that with us today on the podcast. Greg, as always, wonderful, wonderful job. And if you are viewing and listening to us today and are needing the help and guidance that you feel is the time has come, we invite you to visit faithfulandtrue.com, where you can click on the workshops. And if you're one of the men struggling with sexual addiction, please consider registering for the Men's Journey Workshop, which we offer here at Faithful and True every month. We also have the workshop for the women and for couples. Those are all coming up. So with that in mind, we'd like to thank you again for listening. Have a great day, and we hope this coming week is a week filled with many blessings and great vision.